Welcome back to China in the News Conversations with Professor Doug Guthrie. Today, we're diving to the latest chapter of the US China trade war. It seems like tit for tat on tariffs is far from over. The question remains, will President Xi and President Donald Trump be the first one to pick up the phone? Let's set the stage. Since 2018, these tariff exchanges have cost both nations billions. According to the Peterson Institute charts, the numbers have only escalated over time. Doug, let's start with the basics. How do we get here? And why are these tariffs back in focus?
So thanks for having me, Christine, and always so excited to be talking to you about really, really important issues. And I think we're in the middle of a really important moment in history. Um, so in the Trump's first administration, tariffs sort of became his signature weapon. And just to be clear, this goes way back. There are plenty of historians who are saying like Trump used to talk about tariffs in the 80s. And, he's long had this view of the importance of showing muscle and using national boundaries to really kind of create your trade negotiations. And, the art of the deal is his whole thing, right? And so this is his signature weapon, right? And his argument was simple, at least in 2018 and, now. The basic argument is he wanted to reduce the U.S. trade deficit and bring manufacturing jobs back home. And as you and I have discussed in other episodes, the key issue of tariffs is if you raise the price at the border, the idea is that if you make things more expensive coming from cheaper labor areas like China, then you raise the price at the border and you make things more expensive coming into the country, and then people will be more incentivized to buy local because even if manufacturing costs make goods produced within your country more expensive, you've equalized the pricing and now you're going to buy American. The problem with that is that you have to have the manufacturing supply chains in America, right? And so, if you're increasing the costs of an iPhone that is produced in China by 3x, you have to have the argument that, well, you could actually reproduce that iPhone in America, but those manufacturing supply chains don't exist, right? And so,
To add on that, 80 to 90% of baby strollers are manufactured in China. So there is no option. There's no
yeah,
backup in the US that
yeah.
people can buy.
Yeah, and you could talk about, I love that example. You could talk about iPhones, you could talk about baby strollers, you could talk about any number of goods. We just don't have the manufacturing supply chains here anymore. And so the tariff, in my opinion, the tariff war is based on a false premise that if you increase the prices at the border, then you can create jobs in America because you will be able to produce the goods here. But it takes, as you and I know, it takes decades to produce those manufacturing supply chains, and we've let them go over the last 40 years. So, and China in particular has been playing a long game since 2018, 2020. And, when Trump did his first tariffs in 2018 and when he left office in 2020. And, we think they've crafted a detailed playbook to counter U.S. actions on tariffs. Um, and there's a lot of entities involved here. I mean, it's interesting that even the Hong Kong Postal Service got into the action this past week, blocking all packages being mailed to the United States in reaction to what it described as bullying tactics by the Trump administration, right? And so, we have suppliers of iPhones and the suppliers of Apple. We have baby strollers. We have the Hong Kong uh, Postal Service. And so it's a big, there's a lot going on here. But this trade war, I'm very worried it could spin out of control. And so, you know, let's get into it.
Well, you talked about the Chinese government has been preparing for a playbook. Well, I understand working in the tech sector, the Chinese government has been providing incentives for various tech sectors. At the same time, try to decrease its dependency on US exports. So if such a playbook does exist, what might be included in China's long-term strategy? And How is it different from the approach during Trump's first term?
So, my sense is that in the first term, in 2016, Trump was talking about it. 2018, he came out with 300 billion in tariffs, and it was just sort of like this blanket process. And going back to that time period, you and I think, both believe that it was again sort of a haphazard policy. Um, we have talked about in the past, you and I, Christine, that there was one moment of tariffs, which I think was a sort of an interesting caveat or play in the tariff discussion, because when Biden put his 13 billion, not 300 billion like Trump, but 13 billion in tariffs in 2022, it was very specifically on electric vehicles and really meant to target, I think, BYD. Um, but again, to go back to this issue, in order to have tariffs work, you have to actually have the internal manufacturing supply chain to counter this. And so it was interesting because Biden and Elon Musk had problems in the early stages of the Biden administration, because Elon Musk was left off of the list of people to come talk about the electric vehicle industry. And so I think they had a difficult relationship. But Biden's tariffs in that period were actually really smart, because 13 billion in tariffs targeting electric vehicles, but we actually have the internal vertically integrated manufacturing supply chain such that if you raise the prices at the border, people will buy American, right, and create jobs for America. And so that's sort of what the issue was back then. Now, to your question, going back to this time period, my guess is that China has been building the playbook for this, right? And what is the playbook? The playbook, I think, involves three features. One is that China has been working to pivot away from its fundamental reliance on the United States. For many years, the United States, post Deng Xiaoping, coming to visit Jimmy Carter and normalizing relationships with the United States, China has grown over the course of the 90s and 2000s to be the US's largest trading partner. And that has changed a little bit post-Trump tariffs in 2018, because China was shipping a lot of goods to Mexico and Mexico was shipping those goods to the United States. And so Mexico supplanted China as the largest trading partner. But there's been a fundamental dependence. And so to the first part of your answer to your question, China has been building a playbook to pivot away. How is it doing that? One is the Belt and Road Initiative, right? And so Belt and Road Initiative, you may recall, is initially brought into the playbook in 2008, but it was sort of laid fallow. And then when Trump came back into power, not Trump, I'm sorry, when Xi Jinping came into power in 2013, we see a reinvigoration of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative, you could just argue as well, how's China building its trading partners around the world, and how's it targeting areas that are sort of in the South China Sea and in the Indian Ocean and ultimately Africa and then across Central Asia. But this is really, in my view, a pivot away from it's laying the groundwork, and it's a long-term process of laying the groundwork of a pivot away from dependence on the United States. And then the second piece of this is the reinvigoration of the BRICS economy, or the BRICS coalition, right? So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then 2 years ago there was a huge invigoration of or growth, adding 7 countries to the BRICS coalition. And so I think that this is really part of the playbook, is just like, we're going to move away from this, and we're not going to have fundamental dependence on BRI, um, or on BRICS. And so then those two things I think are really critical. And then the final thing that I think is really central here is, you know, I think China has been preparing its population for this, right? I think it's really been creating a notion that we're going to continue doubling down on the idea of China being eventually the largest economy in the world, not being fundamentally dependent or beholden to the United States, but continuing to grow in this positioning. And so I think that under Xi Jinping for the last 12 years, this government has been preparing for this moment. And I think, again, that was heightened under the Trump administration and under Trump's first tariffs, but they've been ready. They've been waiting for this. Yeah.
Yeah, I also noticed that Chinese folks in China are we here talk about buy American, but in China, there's actually buy local, buy Chinese goods. And Chinese goods are increasing in quality. So, like, I'll give you an example skincare. It used to be people buy it from France, Japan, and there is increasing number of Chinese national that simply just buy local brands that's being established. So there's a element of nationalism and element
Yeah.
of saving money and not spending on luxury goods from Japan and France.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant point. Yeah, and I think, I mean, you and I both have a lot of contacts inside of China, and I always every week get on the phone with my China team and ask them, what are people saying? What are Chinese citizens, what are netizens saying? And to your point, like there is a lot of rhetoric about sort of a nationalistic approach to consumerism and buy Chinese, and we've heard this in America too, buy American. But I think that China has really been preparing the population for this for the last 6 years at the very least.
So speaking of buy American, I love how I've been seeing on TikTok where there will be Chinese that basically have a picture, doing a short video on, let me introduce you to all the American products I have in my house. Nothing. So
Right,
essentially, they're saying, well, I don't really have dependency on American products, whereas you guys have dependency on Chinese products.
right.
So, speaking of in this trade war, China holds many cards. Rare earth minerals are one of the key ones. They dominate this market, and we did an episode on that. With American companies like Apple relying on these resources, it is definitely a leverage point. So there's also issues of the US Treasury bonds. China was once the largest holders, yet they've been dumping them, contributing to higher interest rates and the devalued dollar. Now Japan comes in as the biggest holder of US Treasury bonds with over 1 trillion. So in fact, when I was in Spain for a family vacation last week, I noticed our dollar was near a 3-year low against the euro. It was a 1 US dollar was only worth about 88 cents euro. So Doug, how does this play into the larger economic battle?
Well, so it's a great question, Christine, because again, when we think about trade wars and tariffs, we think about like the costs of goods. And we're going to say that there's 145% tariff on any goods that come from China. And that's going to force people to move away from Chinese goods and buy American. But as we just discussed, well, if you want to buy American, you have to have the manufacturing supply chains here. But to your point, there are a lot of other issues that are under the radar screen here for a lot of people. So, first issue you mentioned was rare earths. I mean, this is a really, really interesting and important issue. And, as China scholars, you and I we hear about this stuff all the time. So China today, I think that is in control of the refinement of about 90 to 93% of rare earths. But, just as an individual, I don't totally know what that means. Like, it's just, okay, I understand that there are really critical things for building products around the world, and you can get these products in many places around the world, sub-Saharan Africa, the Ukraine. Um, but China has been very smart over the last 45 years of developing the refinement infrastructure for basically producing these rare earths. And so you and I have talked about this example before, but I'll say it for our listeners now. I never knew what this could actually mean. And there in about 2013, there was a dust up between Japan and China in the East China Sea. And, I was asking some Apple engineers, like, what did they think of this? And what did this mean? And one of the Apple engineers said to me, well, have you ever heard of neodymium, Doug? And I was like, I don't even know what that means. And he said, neodymium is a rare earth. And neodymium is critical for producing these little things called AirPods. And if you don't have that magnet, you can't produce the AirPods. And so suddenly, a little company called Sony no longer had access to neodymium. And this had a huge implication for the Japan-China uh, dust up in the East China Sea. And so suddenly Japan backed down and, China got what it wanted. And so it just gives you, like, again, these are things like we hear the words rare earth. And for me, I didn't always understand what they meant until I talked to some engineers. And like, I was like, oh, okay. So China basically controls the production of 93% of neodymium in the world. And if companies like Apple and Sony can't get access to that rare earth, that's a problem. And so, it's a very technical way of thinking about this, but the big issue is China controls the production of about 90%, the refinement of about 90% of the rare earths in the world. So, again, to your earlier question, they've been playing this game for a while. They've been preparing themselves. Um, but you also asked about the financial side, and I love your example about your family vacation in Spain and just thinking about like, wow, okay, the U.S. dollar seems weaker than we remember it.
3 year low, three
3 year
years low.
low,
Yeah.
right? And we used to talk about this all the time when we were watching China grow up in the 1990s and 2000s. China was voraciously buying U.S. Treasury bonds. And a lot of us in the China scholarly community were like, why? Why? Is it just that the U.S. economy, and there were a lot of economists in the United States who was like, well, it's the best investment in the world. The most stable investment in the world that guarantees anything is the United States economy. So buy U.S. bonds. Um, but the interesting thing is that the Trump administration, as much as we like to think about Donald Trump as a business person, he has made the U.S. economy much more unstable. And so that's just an interesting thing because one of the things about bonds, and it's the same with stock markets, but bonds in particular is you want stability, you want predictability. You want to know that this economy is going to continue to produce at this rate. There won't be a recession. There will be the valuation of this economy is going to continue to be what it is. And so when you create the whimsical uncertainty of like, okay, tariffs here now 145% tariffs, now that okay, a 90-day hold on these. It creates unpredictability. But the second issue that's really important here is when you have a country like China that is the single largest holder of US Treasury bonds, and they start to dump those bonds because either A, they think the US economy is not a predictable source of investment, or they just want to do what they can to show that the U.S. economy is not an investment they want to make anymore. This is a powerful position for the Chinese government to be in, and we're starting to see the consequences of that.
You were talking about Trump being a businessman, but just so you know, he has filed for bankruptcy 6 times, Chapter 11 bankruptcy 6 times. So I don't know how good of a businessman. Anyway, so as the trade war escalate, let's pivot to the trade war. Xi Jinping has stated that there are no winners in a trade war, while Trump frames it as a necessary step to restore American manufacturing. But we know the reality is more complex. Will this actually bring job back or just political theater?
So I'm going to answer your question, but let me just jump back on the last thing that you mentioned. There are lots of different kinds of business people. There are business people who are really interested in building economies of their corporations or building economies of a government. And there are business people that are really self-interested in making money for themselves. And so Donald Trump has filed for bankruptcy. I think you said 6 times. It's a lot. But he is a billionaire and he has used those bankruptcies as strategic positioning for himself in the economy. I think he's using the US government in the same way. If you look at what he's doing with cryptocurrencies and the ways in which his own children are getting involved in cryptocurrency, I mean, this is a person who used to talk about cryptocurrencies as just, the root of all evil, and now suddenly he's an advocate of it. So there's business person as a leader of an organization or of a country, and then there's business person as self-interested, and I think he's the latter. Now, to come back to your question, will this really bring jobs back to the U.S. or is this just political theater? Um, I don't want to go so far as to say it's political theater because there is a theory of what could be done if you have a trade war and trade détente and tariffs, um, and then you wanted to go the next step and invest in the building of manufacturing supply chains in America. It can be done, right? And the one example that I always like to talk about is because, my new home, it's my mother's old home and my grandparents' home, but the state of Arizona is where I teach now at the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. And This is an economy that, 30 years ago was just thought of as sort of a desert landscape. And what do you do here? Maybe look at Las Vegas and let's build casinos. Um, but this is a place that has been transformed in the last 10 years. I was just on an event yesterday in which we had panelists that were talking about the Arizona economy. It's the fastest growing economy in America at the state level. Phoenix is the fastest growing economy in America at the city level. And part of this is because of the CHIPS Act and Joe Biden committing $6.5 billion to the state of Arizona to attract capital. And then you have TSMC, the most important semiconductor microchip organization probably in the world. And they've already invested $65 billion in the building of the manufacturing supply chain for three manufacturing fabs in Arizona, and they've committed another 100 billion. So this is 175 billion dollars invested in the Arizona economy to build the manufacturing supply chain and thus have a really viable, powerful economy. So, like the idea that tariffs are just ridiculous and you can't rebuild manufacturing supply chains in the world, I don't want to go that far. It can be done, but it takes time. It takes investment. It takes investment from central government, I shouldn't say the central government, but the national government, and investment from state governments and investment from city governments. And so it is doable, but it takes commitment to doing it. It takes financial resources and governmental commitment and politics and all kinds of things. And so I want to stop short of saying that this is ridiculous. That being said, what's coming out of the national government and the Trump administration seems ridiculous to me because you can't just put tariffs up and say like, all right, everybody, rebuild your manufacturing supply chains and let's go. Like this takes careful strategic planning. And so, I think Trump is just like using it as showmanship and, he's not working closely with local governments to actually make this happen. And so, I just think that right now, the way Trump and JD Vance and Peter Navarro are handling this seems ridiculous to me. But I just want to stop short of saying it's completely ridiculous because it can be done and it's being done in places like the state of Arizona. Um, and in addition, like I think, there's a long history here. And, Chinese people feel the shadow of the century of humiliation, which goes back to the first Opium War in China, and then follows up through the Sino-Japanese War and then the rape of Nanking. And so there was like a century in which China just felt awful in the world, and that has a lingering effect. Like things really matter here in terms of thinking about like what the historical landscape is for how China has experienced the world and how China came out of that with the Communist Revolution and Mao. And that was also a disastrous period. But then after Deng Xiaoping came to the United States to meet with Jimmy Carter and open China up, we saw China really go on an interesting, methodical tear of building the strongest manufacturing supply chain in the world. And so, you know, there's a history here that Chinese people really feel. And so, like the idea that China is now going to just have to kowtow to President Trump, I just think Chairman Xi and the Chinese people are not up for it. And then again, I've mentioned this already, but the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS coalition, these things have been in preparation for some time, and so it's a really powerful moment for China, and I think the U.S. is losing this negotiation, if you will. Um, but
Well,
yeah.
let's talk about Apple, where we both worked. Um, iPhones have been exempted from tariffs. How did Tim Cook navigate these treacherous political water?
So, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting moment because um, I think Tim Cook I think he's a brilliant business person. I mean, we often talk about, you know, Steve Jobs is the visionary who created new products that changed the world, and that's for sure true. But in my analysis of Apple's history, I think it was a fascinating period because, Steve Jobs was the founder of Apple in 1976. He was fired from his own company in 1985. because he wasn't a very good leader, and then he was invited back because they needed a visionary person in 1997, and then he really had become a different kind of leader, and he hired Tim Cook, who was, a genius in operations management. And Tim Cook took Apple into China in 2001, right after China's entry into the World Trade Organization. Um, and what Apple did in China, Christine, was really magical because, that was a time, it was post World Trade Organization accession. So China could no longer have what we called a quid pro quo for market access, meaning if you want access to China in terms of the manufacturing supply chain and in terms of the consumer market, you have to give us something. You have to give us technology. You have to have a joint venture. But post World Trade Organization entry, that became illegal by WTO standards. And so Tim took Apple into China and he built the most immaculate and powerful presence in China. He didn't build joint ventures, but he used his operations specialization and all of his ops engineers to really help out Chinese suppliers, who would be Apple suppliers, operate in really efficient, powerful ways. I mean, there's a book coming out called Apple in China, the capture of the world's most powerful company. It's by Patrick McGee. And basically, I mean, he equates what Tim Cook and Apple did to China to the Marshall Plan. I mean, he basically makes the case that we haven't seen this kind of investment in a country except for when the U.S. government and the European allies invested in the Marshall Plan to develop countries like Japan and other places. And so, like, one of the things that's so interesting about this is that Tim Cook has been playing this game a long time. He started with Apple in 2001, took Apple into China in 2001, and he's still there, and he's still very, very well known. I was a part of the discussions when Apple was going through difficult times with Xi Jinping in 2014, 15, 16. And, we had to negotiate really complex deals, which made explicit for the Chinese government just how much Apple was giving to China. So even though we didn't have joint ventures and we didn't have explicit technology transfer agreements, we made it clear that all of the ways that we were training um, Apple suppliers, was the passage of what we call in the field of economics and management tacit knowledge, right? So this was a time when it wasn't explicit technology transfer, but Chinese companies were getting a tremendous amount. And Tim Cook, I think, has been a genius at playing that role. I think he's done very well in basically convincing the Chinese government that we're here and we're partners of China. And by the way, it wasn't just the tacit knowledge that was being passed. Eventually, Apple built things like R&D centers in Shenzhen and data centers in Guizhou province. And, there's been a lot that Apple has given to China such that, it's very clear to Xi Jinping and his administration that Tim Cook is a partner of China. And so, when they had the recent group of CEOs who came over for the economic coalition meeting a couple of weeks ago, Tim was there. And so I think Apple's played this game really, really well, and they've done it brilliantly.
Well, let's switch focus. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. So, the stock market. Trump doesn't seem to anticipate how his policies would have tanked the market. However, the billionaires were able to profit. Could this be a form of manipulation? I just want to add that Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene made a quick profit as the president turned the spigot on, off and on with the tariff. This just tells me, remember Martha Stewart insider trading? That looks almost amateurish and trivial compared to this stock manipulation. Comments?
I mean, Christine, this is so sad and depressing to me. I mean, on the one hand, I just don't want to believe it because, I mean, okay, so maybe President Trump and Vice President JD Vance are just stupid and they haven't had economics courses and they don't understand like what tariffs are or what they do or like how, willy-nilly changing of these things will make markets uncertain and stocks will drop. But to your point, the number of billionaire insiders who have made significant amounts of money with, okay, what if President Trump or somebody from his administration was on the phone with a couple of people and saying like, okay, I'm going to put a 90-day reprieve on the tariffs, buy low, sell high. Who knows if that was happening? I mean, you raised the issue of Marjorie Taylor Greene, but there are plenty of players who have made a lot of money just as the stock markets have jumped around. It may be an insider case, and that just is so depressing if that's true, Christine. But who knows? Again, we were talking a few minutes ago. You talked about is Donald Trump a good business person? Well, he's had six bankruptcies, but he's done okay for himself and for his family. And so, you know, if that's what's going on, I think it's just a terrible. It's just corruption, but it's also just a terrible statement on U.S. politics. And so, yeah, I don't know.
I used to be so proud of United States because even though we have corruption, we would crush it. We would investigate. The Justice Department would step in. Now I don't think so anymore. Um, let's turn to a topic that has emerged as a potential game changer, Taiwan, where I was born, as a bargaining chip to end the trade war. Some analysts suggest that Taiwan's geopolitical significance could be leveraged by either side to gain an upper hand. What's your take on this?
So, Christine, I mean, you mentioned that you were born in Taiwan, and uh, you know, I personally like sort of had my birth as a China scholar in Taiwan as well. The first place I spent in Asia was the year I was 19, 20 years old in Taiwan and learning the Chinese language and falling in love with Asia and falling in love with the Chinese culture. Um, Taiwan's an incredibly important place in the world. I often tell my students when we're talking about this, I just talk to them about the intellectual history of how things have evolved. And in order to understand Taiwan's complexity in the world, you have to understand a little bit of the history. Um, and you have to understand things like the Century of Humiliation and then the Sino-Japanese War, and then the fact that Taiwan was occupied by Japan post Sino-Japanese War, and then, the issue of after the Kuomintang, the nationalist government's defeat by the communists, them retreating to Taiwan, and then Taiwan emerging as one of the great innovative economies in Asia and in the world. And I always tell my students this, they don't seem to grasp the enormity of this kind of issue. We used to call these four places in Asia the NICs, the newly industrialized countries, and they were
Oh,
South.
when I was growing up, we called it the Asian tigers, the four Asian
Right.
tigers. Are we talking about the same South
Yeah.
Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
So
when
they
I
were
was
called
growing
the
up,
Asian
it's called the
tigers. There
tigers. Yeah.
were books written about that, but in the academic literature, they were called the NICs, the newly industrialized countries. And then China got upset about that. And China said, in the academic world, I'm sorry, guys, you can't call these the newly industrialized countries because Taiwan and Hong Kong are not countries. They're part of China. So then the academic literature pivoted and we started stop calling them, they were still called the tigers, but then we started calling them, instead of the NICs, we called them the NEs, the newly industrialized economies, right? And that was a very explicit thing that happened in the academic literature because we were given the signal like, guys, this is calling Taiwan a country is a problem. And so Taiwan just has a very long and important history, just in terms of everything that has gone on there and the ways in which, and just again, the importance of this history is really interesting. So when the nationalists were defeated by the communists and retreated to Taiwan, they sort of still claim to the world and to the United States that, okay, we may have lost that war, but we're still the legitimate representatives of China, right? And Taiwan held China's seat on the Security Council in the United Nations until 1972.
I
I mean,
know. I was
that,
shocked.
that's
I was
kind
shocked
of
going back in history, looking as, wow, this little Taiwan sat on the Security Council.
So think about that. And so like, we often think of the problems of Richard Nixon and Watergate but in the China world, China scholarly community, we think Nixon and Kissinger were pretty amazing because Nixon is the person who began to normalize relationships with China and et cetera. So anyway, the point is that Taiwan is a really, really important political issue and political dynamic here, but it's also an important economic dynamic. And so, and my view, and I don't have any inside information in terms of people talking to me in Chairman Xi's administration, but just having watched him over the last 12 years, I feel very confident that he wants to retire, one, with China being the largest economy in the world, and two, with it being very clear to the world that there is but one China and Taiwan is a part of China, right? And I believe that that movement started a couple of years ago in about 2018. There was an agreement in 1997 about the Hong Kong transition back to China, and it was a 50-year agreement, meaning that in 2047, administratively, Hong Kong would be 100% under Beijing's control. And Xi Jinping said, I'm not waiting till 2047. We're doing this now, right? And that was, I think, a really big and important moment because I think it was a signal to the world about Hong Kong, but it was also a signal to the world about China, about Taiwan. And so I think Taiwan is a really important player here in terms of how we're thinking about these issues. And there's a it's a very important economic player, but it's also a very significant player in terms of, its economic position in the world, right? Again, we talked a few minutes ago about TSMC in the state of Arizona. I mean, TSMC is one of the most important semiconductor microchip producers in the world, right? And so the fact that this is a Taiwanese company, right? And then Foxconn is the assembler for iPhones, right? Very important company. And so Taiwan plays a very important role economically. But then the question is just what does that mean, as the issue of Taiwan independence grows, right? And so, not the issue of, but the idea of, and there's a significant part of the Taiwanese population. I mean, it was under the nationalists in the 1980s that Taiwan officially became a democracy, meaning that there were open elections. And then the nationalists were competing against the Democratic Progressive Party. And then, eventually people like Chen Shui-bian and a number of other leaders kind of came into the fray. And, there's an argument that's being played here. Now, to go back to what does China think about this, I think, again, I believe Xi Jinping believes that he will, before he retires, it will be official that Taiwan is a part of China and that there's one administrative system, not one country, two systems, but one administrative system. And, that's sort of playing a role here. Now, some of my sources in China tell me that this is a really, really interesting and important moment because in one way, the United States has maybe kind of held off any dramatic issue here because China was so closely tied to the United States economically. But now that Trump has sort of blown that up, my sources in China tell me that there's a movement, among citizens and netizens in China that are saying, now's the time. Now's the time for, a more aggressive annexation of Taiwan because we don't even need the US as our largest trading partner anywhere because they're fast forwarding our sort of delinking from the United States. So I think Taiwan is a big issue, Christine, and it's I can't predict what's going to happen in the immediate sense, but it's scary. I think it's
Well, uh, Taiwan was expecting, for example, the Seventh Fleet in Pacific would come help. However, given that Trump said that he would want protection money for Taiwan, it's no longer certain that he would defend Taiwan against
right.
China. So, but
Yeah.
well, what you just analyzed, there's a lot of risk putting this on the table. So, does that mean neither side would dare to bring Taiwan into the trade war conversation since it's so sensitive?
I mean, it's a great point, and it's a great question. I know that there are people, and I've heard some of them talk in, the state of Arizona who are sort of thinking that having TSMC build its three fab sites in the state of Arizona is like this is the moment where we can really push forward. So I know that there are people, I can't speak for the Trump administration level, but I know there are people who think about this at the economic levels in places like the state of Arizona. But um, I just think this is really the tinderbox. And so it's hard to predict and I just don't know if it's Peter Navarro that's just advising President Trump. I think anything is possible, and I think there's a lot of danger there. But there have to be people telling him that this is really a critical hot button issue, and are you going to be ready to go to war over this? And I think I mean, my final prediction on this, Christine, is I think there have to be people, whether they're, JD Vance or Peter Navarro, but probably Tim Cook, who are whispering in the administration's ear and saying, like, guys, we are really exposed here. And if it was the case that we were going to fight a war with China, Apple, Tesla, Walmart, and a number of other American companies, but those three are the biggest players, would be at huge risk economically. And so I have to guess that they're going to make decisions that are based on economics over this.
So, Doug, I would like you to predict who is more likely to fold, the United States or China?
I'm very clear on that prediction, Christine. I think it's the United States. I think we are too exposed economically. And I think China, to the earlier part of our conversation and the China playbook idea, China's been preparing for this. And both economies can be hurt. China's economy, in my opinion, for the general populace is stronger than the US economy. I mean, remember, you and I have talked about this before, but the US economy, yes, it's the largest economy in the world in terms of GDP, but there's been a huge shift out of our economy of manufacturing, union wage kinds of jobs, and they've been replaced by low income minimum wage jobs. And the economy still looks strong because we're in high-end service sectors. We're the most powerful economy in the world. So investment banking, consulting, accounting, legal. But that's not helpful to the general populace, right? And the general populace, the MAGA people, there's a lot of people who are working class people who elected Donald Trump. And so I just think we're at such risk, so much more risk than the Chinese economy is. And I think as China moves to pivot away, the US economy is going to be hurt more. And as people like Tim Cook and Elon Musk are on the phone with the administration saying, what are you guys doing? Do you realize how much we're at risk here? My guess is that the US folds. China wins this. China wins the trade war.
Well, I'm gonna challenge that a little bit. So if you go to Yiwu, which is in the Zhejiang province, there are a lot of exporters, right? And there you have gone on social media platform claiming that they're really hurt because Americans are no longer ordering from them because the tariff, even though so what makes you think that small business folks in China can last this long?
Well, so it's a great point. I don't want to I don't want to lighten this for any group. Everybody is going to be hurt, right? So small businesses in China are going to be hurt by the tariffs and the trade war. Small business in the U.S. too, right? On the panel I was a part of just yesterday at Thunderbird, uh, one of the key people who was part of the Arizona Chamber of Commerce just talked about small businesses and the ways in which small businesses in Arizona were going to be hurt by the tariffs. And so it's not just, that's one of the things that's interesting about the trade war is you have the 145% tariffs, but oh, we are going to give exemptions to iPhones and computers and microchips and a couple of other things, which is great, except those are all much more high-end corporate goods. But I haven't heard anything about exemptions for blue jeans and toys, which also come to out of China and go to companies like Walmart and Target. And, so I think that everybody's going to be hurt. So I'm not making the case that Chinese small organizations, small companies are not going to be hurt. They are. But there's two things that are really important here. China has a much more sophisticated and developed infrastructure for the manufacturing supply chain. And so if they start to pivot to other consumer markets, it will take time, but they have the supply chain in place to make that pivot to places like India and Africa and Central Asia, and they can just continue to do it. Um, the second thing that is more of a cultural issue is, I mean, you speak Chinese, so, but, for our audiences, there's a term in Chinese called 吃苦, which means to eat bitterness, right? And, when China was experiencing the century of humiliation and when China was experiencing the famine in which 50 million people died of starvation under Mao. Um, you know, the idea of chirku is part of, if we have to do this for nationalistic reasons, we're going to do it. And the other thing that's really important here, Christine, and then my China team pointed this out to me. Chinese families have much higher savings rates than US families. So if you do US savings as a whole, there are a lot of wealthy families who drag up the savings rate. But if you do it on a per capita family basis, Chinese family savings rates are much higher than the United States. And so I just think, families can suffer. They can eat bitterness, chirku. And I think China wins this trade war.
Speaking of Chinese savings rate, I think it's around 43% of the GDP, whereas US, it's only about 17%. So you're right, Chinese people save. Great insights as usual, Doug. Thank you for breaking this down for us. As the trade war continues, we'll be here to analyze every twist and turn. Thank you again for joining us in China in the News.
So great to be with you, Christine. So enjoy these conversations, even if they're hard at times, but these are really important things for us to be discussing and for people to be listening to. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.